The sun has gone down at Hangman's Hill, and the ghost at Misery Corner isn't walking tonight. So, welcome to the Weird Tales Radio Show, your weekly fix of ghost stories, urban myths, witchcraft, magic, and folklore. And now, here's your host, writer, award-winning journalist, best-selling author, and sometime werewolf hunter, Charles Christian.
Hello and welcome to another episode of the Weird Tales Radio Show, the home of geek, folklore and paranormal entertainment with me, Charles Christian, as once again we delve into the worlds of weirdness, urban myths, arcane histories, geek culture, ghosts, magic, witchcraft, the occult and anything else I will intrigue you. Let's start with an upcoming anniversary on the 25th of May. And it's an anniversary that should appeal to all you geeks out there. In fact, it's not one anniversary, but three we are talking about. The first is Geek Pride Day, when fans of all things geek and nerds celebrate science fiction, role-playing games and cosplay. Inevitably, there is a debate as to when and where it started. Was it on the east coast of the United States in either 1998 or 2001, or was it in Spain in 2006? Anyway, Geek Day. Next up we have Towel Day, which celebrates the life and work of Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy author Douglas Adams. The first Towel Day took place in 2001, 2 weeks after Adams' premature death on 11th of May. And if you don't understand the importance of a towel, here's what the Hitchhiker's Guide has to say. A towel is about the most massively useful thing an interstellar hitchhiker can have. Partly it has great practical value. You can wrap it around you for warmth as you bound across the cold moons of Jaglan Beta. You can lie in it on the brilliant marble-sanded beaches of San Grandinarnas 5. You can sleep under it beneath the stars which shine so redly on the desert world of Kakafroon. Use it as a sail on a mini raft down the slow, heavy river Moth. Wet it for use in hand-to-hand combat. Wrap it around your head to ward off noxious fumes or to avoid the gaze of the ravenous bug-blaster beast of Traal, which is apparently such a mind-bogglingly stupid animal. It assumes that if you can't see it, it can't see you. And you can also wave your towel in emergencies as a distress signal. And, of course, let's not ignore the fact that you can dry yourself off with the towel if it's clean enough. To observe Towel Day, just carry a towel with you throughout the day of the 25th, and if you can find a towel printed with the words "Don't Panic," even better. Finally, let's not forget the People's Revolution of the glorious 25th of May, which was an important event in the Discworld novels of the late Sir Terry Pratchett. Check out the book Night Watch. The slogan of the revolution was "Truth, Justice, Freedom, reasonably priced love and a hard-boiled egg," something we can all agree with. The event is celebrated on Discworld by wearing lilac, either the flower or clothing of that colour. However, following the announcement of Sir Terry's Alzheimer's, here on Earth some people now wear lilac on the 25th, both as a tribute to Sir Terry and to fundraise for Alzheimer's research. But what if you want to celebrate both Towel Day and the glorious 25th? Simple. Carry a lilac-coloured towel with you all day. You can even find lilac-coloured towels embroidered with the words "Don't Panic" on Etsy. Time for this week's interview, and we're pleased to be joined by the American writer and blogger J.W. Ocker as he shares his adventures travelling the world searching out the most obscure oddities of nature, history, art and culture. Who J.W. Ocker, you ask? He's an Edgar Award-winning author of Poland, the hallowed haunts of Edgar Allan Poe, so that's Poland with a P-O-E, not the place in Eastern Europe. He runs the website Otis, Odd Things I've Seen, where he chronicles his visits to various oddities of culture, art, nature and history. His first two books, The New England Grimpendium and The New York Grimpendium, are personal travelogues of his visits to deathly sites in those regions. Both books won Lowell Thomas Awards from the Society of American Travel Writers. His work has appeared in Rue Morgue magazine, the Boston Globe, CNN, The Atlantic, and other places. He's from Maryland, but has lived in New Hampshire since 2008. His non-fiction books, he also writes fiction, his non-fiction books include Cursed Objects, A Season of the Witch, about his time spent in Salem, Poland, and his 2 Grimpendiums. Well, great to be talking to you. Let's start off at the very beginning on how you got started in your pursuit of obscure objects, obscure parts of history, etc. Where did you start? What was your beginning? Did you have a troubled childhood or something?
Possibly, but I don't know if that had an impact. But my starting point was absolute boredom. I was at a point in my life where nothing was going on really. I wanted to be a writer. I was trained to be a writer, but I learned I had nothing to write about. Right, so I was sitting there bored and with nothing to write about. And then I realized somehow, and it's a kind of a dumb realization. That's one probably everybody already has, and I had to come to it on my own. Mm-hmm. That there's interesting stuff out there. Like just driving 5 minutes away, you'll see something interesting. So I started doing that, just going to see things on my own, just Saturday morning on a weekend, going to see something interesting, going back, taking a picture of it, writing 800 words about it, posting it on my own blog. Literally is that. And that kind of just boom, opened up my world, not just to my writing and what I was able to do, but like to my own mind. Like, oh man, this world is super interesting. And everything I've ever heard of, whether it's in history, on TV, and books, happened somewhere physically. So there's something physical to go see. So it was really, it was a very inauspicious beginning to my career.
Right. This is the Odd Things I've Seen, or Otis website.
That's it. That started it all.
That started it all.
Blogger site.
Tell us then about, there's a couple of things there, the New England and New York Grimpendiums and the Hallowed Haunts of Edgar Allan Poe. Let's start with the Grimpendiums. Is the emphasis on grim?
It definitely is. The way I always try to explain that is, it's not a paranormal book. That's where it's shelved all the time, but it's a death. It's sites related to death at the end of the day.
Oh, well, that's cheery. Yes.
Yeah, exactly. Which sometimes can be paranormal, but other times can literally just be a serial killer grave or, a skull carving somewhere. So it's all death related because with Otis, my interests in the odd are pretty wide. Anything in history, art, culture, nature that's odd, I want to go see. But then there are themes that keep popping up because of my own interests. And one of those is the macabre. I am super, super into the macabre. And so it turned out a lot of the oddity I was seeing was macabre. Anything in a graveyard, anything in a museum that had to do with death, anything to do with where a horror movie was filmed, anything like that. And so I realized, there's a ton of that stuff around. And I had just moved to New England from the Mid-Atlantic, from the Washington, D.C. area. And the difference between Washington, D.C. and New England is night and day. New England is older, obviously not as old as your country, but it's relatively older in terms of our country.
We're old England, so yes, of course.
Exactly.
Of course we're older.
but in the U.S., New England is the old part of town.
Yeah.
So, it goes back to the 1600s for us. There's huge Puritan influence, so lots of scary darkness and demons. And for some reason, all the horror authors come out of New England, obviously Stephen King, H.P. Lovecraft, Edgar Allan Poe, they're all New Englanders. So I got up here and realized, my macabre interest continued, but then I realized there's so much up there that I could put it together in a book. So I pitched that. I remember it was my first book I ever pitched. I pitched that idea, death-related items in New England, or literary items in New England. I pitched them all to the same publisher and immediately got back, we don't care about literary sites. We want to hear about the spooky stuff. So why don't you write that book? So that's how that got started. So it's all death-related sites. So what I mean by that is, they're physical places that you can go or artifacts you can see. I'm really obsessed with the physical. If it's just folklore, I don't care as much about it. But if it's folklore tied to a physical thing I can go take a picture of, I'm super interested into it. So in the New York and New England Grimpendiums, it's artifacts and sites connected to people who made their fame in the macabre. Maybe they were horror movie directors or horror writers or horror actors or something like that, either their grave or a place they filmed at. So that's one section. Another section was weird grave sites and tombs and cemeteries, serial killer sites, tragic events and serial killer sites is another one. Monsters, cryptids, and ghosts is another section. So all of that was in one book. It was a mad dash for a year across each of those regions of the United States. I think I crossed 5,000 miles for the New England Compendium driving and like 9,000 miles for the New York Compendium. So a lot of road trips to really creepy places.
Yes, because of course we tend to forget that New York is a state as well as a city, and
it is. Yes, yes.
Goes all the way up to Canada, doesn't it?
It touches, not quite, but it touches the Great Lake that touches Canada. So it's pretty close. Pretty close.
Yeah, it's a big place.
It does. It does touch Canada. Sorry, I totally forgot about Niagara Falls. You're dead right.
Yeah.
It touches.
And of course, Niagara Falls has its own amount of weird and grim, hasn't it? With people jumping over it and sailing over it and...
Oh, totally. Lots of those kind of daredevils gone wrong situations on Niagara for sure.
What about, you mentioned movies. Mm-hmm. What sort of movies does that lend itself to?
Basically the horror genre. There's a lot of horror movies that kind of really, again, they like to access that New England vibe. So they either film there or they take place there. And it was everything from one of the favorite movies that I always bring up from 1999 is Session 9, which is a tiny little film starring David Caruso, about a bunch of guys who go into an abandoned asylum in Massachusetts as asbestos cleaners, and then just weird stuff happens. And the beauty of that movie, besides it being a really good movie, is it actually took place in an actual abandoned asylum.
Right.
So that stood until probably the early 2000s. And so, I visited, by the time I moved up here, that asylum had been turned into condos, as most of the New England asylums happen. Yeah. They become apartments and condos. But there still was enough of the site left. So it was a macabre site intrinsically, but also add a horror movie on top of that. It's double macabre. Yeah. But you can still go there and see the facade is still there. It still looks the same from the front. The graveyard, the asylum graveyard is still there. There's a gazebo or two. So there's actual filming sites that still exist from there. So I kind of like that. I kind of like watching a horror movie and treating it almost like a vacation photo. We're like, oh, I've been there. Oh, I've been there.
Yeah.
So that kinds of stuff. But also Main Street stuff like The Witches of Eastwick was filmed in Connecticut. Mm-hmm. With Jack Nicholson. So just tons of movies. And I'm a big horror movie fan. So I couldn't resist. Like, that's probably the section that people question me the most about in those books, but I'm like, I have to visit horror movie filming locations. It's just like it hallows those like buildings and lands for me for some reason.
And presumably on sort of a historical note, you'd have visited Salem, wouldn't you?
Oh, definitely. I visited Salem for the New England Compendium. Actually, I mean, in my life, I visited probably 4 or 5 times a year these days because I live 40 minutes away.
Oh, right.
But
yes.
I included it in the New England Compendium, and then I had to write an entire book about it. So that was Season with the Witch. That was my 4th book, where I moved to Salem for an entire month of October, the craziest month of the year in that crazy town, and lived there downtown, like right in I could smell the incense from all the witch shops, and wrote a book about my experience there. So again, nonfiction, just all the experiences I had, all the people I met. I interviewed everybody from the mayor to the street performers to witches, of course. Did all the activities, the cheesy ones, the touristy ones, the historic ones, and just learned about that. I just went, eye deep in that place and just really, really had a blast.
Does H.P. Lovecraft crop up in your book?
Oh, totally. Because, I mean, basically Providence is full of H.P. Lovecraft sites. That's where he lived. That's where he spent most of his time. When I wrote the book, there wasn't very much kind of marking him out as far as like the city of Providence, which is the capital of Rhode Island, which is the smallest state in the Union.
Yeah.
There wasn't much kind of marking him out as an honor. There was like one little plaque and a collection in a library. And when I did it for the New England Compendium, that's all the sites I could find, the physical sites I could find. These days, though, there's like 4 or 5 plaques. There is an entire square named after him with like a sign with tentacles wrapped around it. There's plans for a full-size statue. There's a bust of him in the local library. It's almost like it's in the past 10 years since I wrote that book, that's become like just whatever, Lovecraft Central in an even bigger way. And of course he's buried there, so with his grave as well.
Yeah. Do you touch on the towns that were or the locations that were the inspiration for his fictional places? Because obviously he's very much about the place, and the way he describes Dunwich and various ports and things.
Yeah, even though he was somewhat of a homebody, he was also a traveler. And you're exactly right. I went to a bunch of the sites that inspired his towns, that inspired his horror, which includes, by the way, Salem. He went to Salem and based a few of his stories there, and you can actually see some of the buildings still there. Obviously, they don't celebrate Lovecraft in Salem like they do in Providence, but there's this entire. You can almost take an entire Lovecraft tour of Salem. I also, for the New York book, he lived in Red Hook, New York for, a year and a half of his life.
Yeah.
So in his condo or his whatever do they call those down there?
Brownstone, was it?
Yeah, his brownstone. That's exactly right. It's still standing. You can go down there. There's no like plaque to him, but it's still there. And of course, that area inspired his Horror from Red Hook story. So that as well. But he went to like St. Augustine in Florida. He went to Baltimore. He actually did. So you mentioned Poeland was my third book where I visited all the Edgar Allan Poe sites. He did the same thing 200 years earlier. Not as many as I had because there just weren't as many around back then. But he would go to like all these sites where Poe lived, where Poe wrote something, and just decry the lack of like on no plaques and no statues back in his day. So he was a bit of he got around for a person who was scared of everything outside of his house.
Yeah. So tell us about Poeland, and I just point out for anybody mishearing that's Edgar Allan Poe land, not the very large country in Europe next to Russia.
That's exactly right. It's a pun, not a very intelligent one because you always have to explain it. So what I did with Poeland, again, I'll never not be obsessed with the physical. But with Poeland, after the two Grimpendiums, which were basically essay-based books, each one was a series of about 100 or so essays. Mm-hmm. I wanted one that was more connected. That wasn't just essay, then the next essay. I wanted one that told us an entire story across that nonfiction book. But I still wanted to see physical stuff and travel. So what I did was I didn't realize I was doing this at first, I don't think. But I wrote a biography of Poe, but I told it through the physical sites and artifacts left behind today, or 2016, whenever I wrote it. Mm-hmm. So I was going to, there's a lot preserved for Poe. So I went to places like the site where his birth home was, which doesn't stand anymore. The site where I went to the room where he honeymooned in Virginia. That still stands. There are 3 different statues of him in 3 different cities. Plaques everywhere where he wrote The Raven has a plaque. I've held pieces of his coffin in my hand, pieces of his hair. I rifled through collectors, very, very big collectors of Poe. I went everywhere. So he lived in about 5 or 6 different states and in London. So he was always on the move because he was poor. He was always trying to find the next job, the next job, the next job. And every single state honors him in some way. So I visited all 6 states from north of Boston all the way down to South Carolina, which is basically most of the East Coast. And then I came to London for a week to look at I forgot the place already where he went to school. He went to school outside of London in Stoke. Oh, it just flew past my head. Anyway, so he went to London there and based his doppelganger story on going to school there. And then, of course, one of the biggest collectors of Poe in the world was based in Brighton at the time. So I went to Brighton to go rifle through Peter Fawn's collection. Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Stoke-on-Newington. That's what it is. That's where he went to school.
Stoke Newington.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah, that's it.
Yeah. Yes, I was racking my head trying to remember where he'd gone to school. One of the other topics you cover here are cursed objects.
Yes.
Which is always a good one because everybody knows about cursed objects, and in fact, probably most people have something or know something in their own family that, we threw it away because it brought us bad luck, that kind of thing.
Especially over in your world because, whatever, generations going back are filling those attics for a very long time. Yeah, so Cursed Objects is my latest. That came out, I don't know, maybe 6 months ago, pretty recently. And again, continuing my obsession with physical objects. This is almost like a culmination of that because everything in here is an object. It's a cursed object. And obviously anything can be cursed, right? In the lore, people can be cursed and places can be cursed and ideas can be cursed. But I only wanted to cover those objects where, you could accidentally pick one up in a flea market. That was kind of or accidentally see one in a museum. That was kind of my criteria for what kind of a cursed object was. And it's just, I try to find about the 50 most legitimate, most famous and most legitimate cursed objects out there. And what I mean by most legitimate is most of the stuff in the book has actual historical legacy. So it existed as an artifact apart from it just being cursed. So you could actually tell 2 stories about it. You could tell its actual history, the physical history of where it started, where it ended up, who got it next, how it's in the museum, because a lot of this stuff ends up in museums. And then I could tell its supernatural story, like who died,
yeah,
and what's the body count for this object. So that's how I got into that, and it's worldwide. There actually isn't a lot of famous cursed objects. I found out there's not a ton of them. There's tons of cursed objects, just general ones that nobody's ever heard of or are small time. But I found about 50 across the world of cursed objects that I could deal with. And I don't know, again, the spookiness of it and the physicality of these objects is exactly what, again, the culmination of what I want to find in life. Somehow cursed objects is that.
Yeah, I can see that. Yeah. Give us a couple of examples of cursed objects that you feature in your book.
Sure. So one of the ones that people always call out to me as interesting is something called the unlucky mummy. So
is that the one in the British Museum?
It is exactly that
Yes.
one. It's exactly that one. So the story of this one is fascinating for a few reasons. One is it's not a mummy.
Yes.
It's a mummy board, which is the top of the coffin that's painted to look like a person. It's fascinating because it predates King Tut. So obviously King Tut is one of the classic cursed items.
Yes.
His tomb is. But this one predates King Tut and actually probably set the template for the story of King Tut itself. And it was bought by a couple of Englishmen in Oxford students that were just on whatever vacation over in Egypt, brought it back, 4 of them, and apparently, according to the story, at least 2 of them died. Mm-hmm. One of them shot off their hand in a quail hunting incident.
Yes.
And the 4th went financially bankrupt.
Yeah.
But that 4th person was the one that's supposed to have brought it over to England, where it was photographed and documented and carried, and every one of those people died that touched it. And then it was, interred in the British Museum, which every single major museum in this world, I think, has a cursed object in it. And British Museum probably has a few. And the unlucky mummy it's actually even called the unlucky mummy in the British Museum catalog. It's not even like a nickname. It's what they call it.
Yes.
And the idea is that not only did it cause harm to the people who brought it from Egypt and to everyday museum visitors, it also brought harm to the world by sinking the Titanic and starting World War I.
Yes.
So no other cursed object has that kind of powerful story behind it. Obviously, it's not a true story. The unlucky mummy has barely ever left the British Museum. But just the fact that it had captured people's imaginations enough that they had to attach it to, 2 of the biggest tragedies the world's ever seen says something about that object. And what I really love about the object, besides all that, tons of love about it, is you can go see it today. Anybody. Just walk into the British Museum, go to the Egypt wing, and then look for it because you're going to miss it. It's really easy to miss because it's in a room full of fascinating Egyptian artifacts, including actual mummies. So you can walk right past the unlucky mummy, and it's just one of 700 whatever mummy boards, and not realize you're looking at not just a cursed object, but one that has such an infamous notoriety that it's probably one of the most dangerous in the book, technically, if you take into all those rumors. So it's one of my favorite ones. I love it because it's just such a non-intuitive story, and again, anybody can access it anytime they want.
Yes, because it supposedly went on the Titanic, caused it to sink, yet was somehow survived and was rescued and was brought back again to England, wasn't it?
Exactly, that's the story. So it brought the Titanic, and there's tons of mummy stories around the Titanic. Brought the Titanic, it sunk, somehow was rescued. It was put on a boat in Canada, St. Lawrence River. That boat sunk and killed hundreds of people. Still, it was rescued. It's brought back, given to Duke Ferdinand or whoever started World War I, and then World War I started. So that's the story, which is an amazing story, which is not a true one, unfortunately. But the fact that story even exists around this artifact is massive.
Yes, good. Did you pick up on the subsequent rumours that it was haunting the underground lines near the British Museum?
Yeah, yes. And I think at some point, and you'd have to tell me more than I am, so I'm over here in the U.S., but like it feels like there's a time period where every single thing bad that happened to the British Empire or to England or to the however it's changed has been attributed to the unlucky mummy at some point in time. It's your Hope Diamond, basically, at the end of the day.
It is, yes. It was sort of running up and down the subway tunnels, and there were reports of women disappearing and terrible screams and tube trains coming out with bizarre scratch marks on them and so on.
Oh, that's great. Love it.
Some of those rather coincidentally coincided with the launch of one of the, Curse of the Mummy's Tomb type movies. So there's always an angle on that one. Now that's a fascinating one. That one, and I say the sad thing is it's not at all scary, and it's not a mummy, and it's yes.
Yeah, I will say the English, not only do you guys have a ton of cursed objects, but a lot of the famous cursed objects that are elsewhere pass through your country or your hands at some point in time. So it's pretty, there's something to be said for your role in the world of cursed objects.
Yeah. Give us another example of a cursed object.
Sure. Another famous one that I love. Do you want me to stick in England or do you want me to go elsewhere?
Go elsewhere. Okay.
So elsewhere, another good one we have, I'll skip the obvious ones, right? The Hope Diamond is an obvious one.
Yeah.
Although it has a super compelling story. But I think one of my favorites in the U.S. is in Georgia. It's called the Cursed Pillar. And it's just a pillar of stone, freestanding these days. But at one point in time, it was part of an open air market. So it was a pillar that held up a giant roof so that everybody could come and sell their wares. And there's all kinds of stories about this pillar, of it being cursed by a preacher who came to denounce certain practices in the market. It was hit by lightning. It was part of the slave trade. People would be chained to it. Mm-hmm. Some dubitable, some not dubitable situations. But after all these years, after the market disappeared, that cursed object stayed, the pillar. But the best thing about this story is the cursed pillar is almost more a danger to itself than anybody else. So there's been stories of people trying to hack it down with axes and dying in car wrecks. But the cursed pillar has been knocked down 3 different times by trucks. And to this day, right now, it's gone. It doesn't exist because it was knocked down a few years ago. The only thing that survives is the historic plaque that says it stands there, and all of the efforts by the city to rebuild it, because the city rebuilds it every time it gets knocked into. One time it got just directly smashed by a car. Another time a giant bale fell off a truck and smashed to bits. Yeah. It's a stone pillar. It's covered in concrete basically, and it looks like exactly what you think of when you say pillar. But again, it just keeps hurting. It's cursed in the sense that it's probably literally cursed in the sense that it can't catch a break. They move it away from the road, it gets knocked down by a car. They try to make it more historic with a historic sign. It gets knocked down. So it's still not up yet. When I wrote the book, it wasn't up, but any day now they'll re-resurrect it because apparently it's a nice little boon for tourism. is their rationale?
Well, exactly.
But also,
yeah,
there's a story that if they don't take care of it, then the whole entire city is cursed. So there's also that part of it. So
that's a good one. Yes, that is a feature of quite a few legends, isn't it? That
yeah. Take care of the bad thing; it'll be bad to you. Yep.
Yeah.
You're listening to the Weird Tales radio show with Charles Christian.
Do you personally have you purchased any or stumbled across any cursed objects?
I have one about 3 feet behind my head right now where I sit in my study. For the book, because they're travelogues, they're very experiential. I have to, I always joke that the most common word in my books is the word I, because I always have to be a part of them. I'm traveling to them, my experiences with them. And that's what, I don't know, just makes them interesting to me. It's probably a defect of the books, but I just have to be a part of the story. And I knew that if I was going to do a cursed objects book, I had to buy a cursed object. And there's a whole section in the book called The Business of Cursed Objects, where, I visit cursed object museums. There's more than one cursed object museums in this country. People who deal in the business of cursed objects sell them, buy them. People who think of cursed as like a prized marketing term. And the easiest place to get things these days is the internet, right? And eBay has a thriving trade of cursed objects. If you go there today and type in cursed objects, you'll see hundreds of results. And it's so I wanted to buy one.
Most of them were made 3 months ago in China, though, probably.
Exactly. But still somehow I have price tags of at least 3 figures for some reason. So that was part of what me buying the cursed objects. I wanted to make sure I wasn't really contributing to the snake oil of that. So I wanted to make sure it was low priced. I'm going to make sure it was something I liked. Like, it couldn't be hideous. It couldn't be like a demon doll because I wanted to be on my desk while I wrote, and I couldn't be freaked out by it every day. It took me a while. In fact, it took me so long to buy one that eBay started advertising to me across my internet experience. It was targeted ads. We have cursed objects. Come buy cursed objects from us. So the digital marketing machine was after me. But I did buy one. It's a small brass bulldog, a paperweight that somebody said their father bought in China, and that ever since he bought it, it's caused nothing but harm to their family. Impersonal fights, deaths, financial loss, and they were looking to get rid of it. So I bought it for like $11 plus shipping and handling. And, they sent me, the person who sold it to me sent me ominous letters and wrote all over the box, may you get what you asked for. And what I realized while doing that was they weren't really selling me a cursed object so much as they were selling me the experience of buying a cursed object, which is what I really wanted, right?
Yes.
Like in the stories, you always go to get a cursed object, you have to find the smallest, dimmest shop in Chinatown, right? And all around you is just stacks of antiques lit by lamplight. And then you try to buy something, and the proprietor won't sell it to you, right? Yes. He'll never sell it to you. No, don't buy. Even though there's a price tag on it, I'm not selling that. I'm not selling that.
Yes.
I always joke that's how Gremlin starts. But that's how we think of it. These days, with one click buy, you don't get that experience anymore. So this person is really giving me an experience. Just ominous emails, writing in the box, and there was the time there when I was reading this, thinking, "Am I inviting evil into my house? Is this not just a book gimmick anymore? Am I literally? Is it even if 1% of me doubted? That's enough, right?" So then I had it. Fortunately, it didn't have Made in China on it. That would have been a big bummer if that was engraved on it, or copyright 2021. That would have been a big bummer. It was very anonymous, and I kept it with me as I wrote. I took it on vacation with me down to St. Augustine when I was looking to see a cursed rug. I took it down there with me. It was just always around me, and nothing bad happened. I mean, it was a good year for me, and obviously bad things happened to me, but nothing I can contribute to this bulldog. And to this day, it's still there behind my head, just kind of like my memento of my time in cursed object world.
That's fascinating. No, I mean, if it's behind you, hopefully it's on a well-placed shelf. It's not going to tumble off one day.
Yeah, who knows? I joke that like it's a dog, so it takes a dog a little while to like get to know your place and warm up to you and become its true self. Yeah. So maybe it's still in that mode. Any second it'll become its true self, and I'll regret everything I've said on this interview and everything I wrote in the book.
Lovely. What about going back to your Otis and traveling around macabre funerary art and sort of graveyards and things of that nature?
Yes.
What have we got to offer there? I mean, obviously everybody talks about New Orleans and the cemeteries and the tombs down there, but what have been the more bizarre ones you've encountered in the States?
Sure. So there's one in Vermont, in the town of, I can't remember the name. It's a small college town in Vermont. It has a grave with a window in it. It's a flat slab. It looks like almost a hatch of cement or stone. And in the middle of it is a square glass window. And what it is it's a grave from the 1800s of a medical doctor, Dr. Timothy Clark Smith. And he was terrified of being buried alive. We went through that period in the world where doctors weren't the best at diagnosing death. So yes. Sometimes it was a coma. Sometimes it just, and we didn't embalm back then. So it wasn't like once you're on the table and you get stuck with a needle and you'd wake up.
Yeah.
It was just, they rotted. So they had to get put in the ground as fast as possible. And as a doctor, he probably saw that a few times. That was another Edgar Allan Poe obsession, right?
Yeah,
getting
exactly.
buried alive.
Yes.
So he, as a doctor, said, I don't want that to happen to me. So he designed a contraption where the window would look right over his face. It was 6 feet below, but it would look right over his face. There was a set of hidden stairs. There was a breathing tube. There was a bell. Everything he needed if he woke up one day alive and buried. Right. Apparently, it never happened. Apparently, he died for sure. But apparently, he died for real. So that was good news for him. And didn't have to take advantage of his insurance policies. But to this day, you can go see the glass window. You can't see anything in it, fortunately or unfortunately, depending on how macabre you are. It's all corroded. The ground has fallen in. So you look into that window, it's just darkness, which is a little bit scarier, knowing that just like 6 feet below you is like a grinning skull that you can't see looking back at you. But it's one of my favorite graves. I think I've written about it in fiction books as well. Just a grave with a window is super, super awesome to me.
Yeah, that's a spooky one. What about, I mean, we go back to New England again, and H.P. Lovecraft in particular has a thing about hidden tombs and passageways deep beneath old graveyards and things. What are the graveyards like up there? Are there any particular highlights you should look out for?
Yeah, I always point people, and it's funny because I've never found a graveyard with tunnels underneath it, but there is a college here that is supposed to be the place that Lovecraft based that idea on, although they deny that there's tunnels underneath their college. Who knows? But yeah, so what I always tell people to look for in graveyards is 4 things I want. I want it to be full of nature. We treat them like a park, like nice trees and hills and a place to walk. Historical, right? If it goes back old enough, it's a lot of history, a lot of stories underneath that ground. 3 is the artwork, if there's great funeral sculptures or engravings. And the 4th is famous people. I'm always looking for a famous person's grave because, you can't reach them in real life, but in death, you can get like 6 feet away from them. So that's what those are my four quadrants when it comes to graveyards. When it comes to the artwork, so some of that's self-explanatory, but I think the artwork in New England, I think you guys have it a lot over there too, but in the United States, we don't have the macabre iconography on our graves like New England does. So I'm talking skulls with wings, full skeletons, coffins engraved.
Yeah.
We have those on all of our 17th century and 18th century graveyards. And you always see them in movies, and like when somebody wants to make a spooky graveyard, they put a skull on it, and it sounds like it's over the top. But just about every single grave in old New England has skulls engraved on it. So you're walking around, just every single skull is looking at you, and they're all very old and rustic looking and like very, very great. And then statues. You're always looking for statues because they age and they get scary. Even the prettiest statue, if you erect it in a grave, you give it 50 years and it becomes scary. It just darkens, its eyes go away. And then what happens then is, the locals start making spook stories around it. Yeah. So there's almost every graveyard on the world that has a spooky statue has a story around it. So that's always something you want as well.
Yes, that's a good one. I'm just looking at some of my notes I've got here, and ghost towns. You've also written and visited ghost towns.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so it's
I mean, that's a fascinating subject for us because in the UK, apart from a few places that have been covered by a reservoir and underwater now, or are on, there's a village near where I am. It's a military training area that was taken over in the Second World War, and the village has doubled as everything for NATO troops to practice. And so at some stages it was a town in Nazi Germany, then it was a town somewhere in Poland fighting the Russians, and in recent times it's had a minaret put there and it's a town in Iraq or somewhere of that nature. So it's still going in, and you can't visit because it's they use live rounds and things, but actual totally abandoned towns are a bit of a rarity, probably obviously because we're a lot smaller place and there's nowhere to go. But, it always fascinates people in this country and in Europe as well, the concept of a whole town that is then just abandoned and left to rack and ruin.
Yeah, and I'll even parse that further for you because I totally share that fascination. We basically have two types of ghost towns in the States. So the ones out west are the best. The ones out, in the desert and on the West Coast are the best because those are still standing buildings. I've been to a few of them, like Rhyolite in Nevada. And you can see that's the bank. That was the saloon. This was, and they're all just empty shells at this point in time. And again, those stories are usually miners. Miners went out there, and then the mining vein dried up, and then the entire town dried up, and then everybody left, and nobody tore down the buildings. Because why would you do that? Why would you expend the effort? So you got to the west, and it's just full of those. In New England, we don't have that, unfortunately. Almost all of our ghost towns, are just cellar holes in the forest. And what that means is, so it's a similar story to the West in that, it's just older stories. They're again, going back to the colonial times, they'd come out to a forest and be like, okay, we need timber. So they'd build a town to start cutting down timber. And eventually, whatever, the roads didn't get built there, or the town flooded or fell on bad luck, and they just couldn't sustain the town, so they would leave. But in this case, over time, those houses degraded and were torn down. So now when you go through a forest in New England, you'll see two things. You'll see stone fences, like 2 to 3 foot tall, loose stone fences, because at one point in time, New England was all fields back in the early days because it just farmed. And since then, we've let it forest back, which is kind of nice. But then you still see those edges of those fields marked out as stone fences, just wandering through the forest. And then it's holes. It's a hole that's lined with cellar rocks. So it's just, once upon a time, there's a house here, and now it's just a depression in the earth. So then they're a different kind of evocative. Like when you say ghost town, inevitably it's those old West towns that you think about. But New England, you say ghost town, you say, oh, okay, holes in the forest. So it's not as dramatic. It's definitely spooky, but it's not as dramatic. Although I will say, you mentioned drowned towns. We have a few of those as well, including one that was supposed to be drowned and then didn't. So they, again, same thing, tried to flood. They evacuated 6 towns in the middle of Massachusetts, wanted to flood it for the Quabbin Reservoir, which feeds Boston. They did it, evacuated, flooded it. But then one of the towns was apparently above the water level. So they, after kicking people out, ripping down all their houses, this town survived. So now you go there, and it's, a hump of land. You can see the courtyard. There are streets. There are cellar holes, lots of cellar holes. partial walls built up, all from this town that should be, 100 feet underwater, but somehow survived. So drowned towns particularly fascinate me as well. I just love that idea of them being down there. And the fact they failed at this one and still up there. Now it's a real ghost, a dry ghost town, like a regular ghost town, is a great twist on the story.
Yeah. I mean, we get that over here where when there's a drought and the water levels fall and the town mysteriously reemerges. And
so evocative. Love it.
Yeah, yes. Right. Lovely. And so I believe you're now starting to write some fiction. Tell us about that, because there's a big difference between non-fiction and fiction, and
huge,
it's not a case of you just make up more stuff with the fiction. I mean, it's an entirely different reading experience for the reader, and I know it's an old saying that every journalist has a book inside them, but just because you've been writing columns all your life about particular topics doesn't mean it automatically translates and you can then write fiction. You can often write very bad fiction.
Yeah. Which you could definitely probably launch against me, honestly. So like, my voice is naturally nonfiction. That's kind of what I started with. That's what I find the easiest. That's what I find the most fun. And that's what I find the most satisfying. So at the end of one of my nonfiction books, that the actual book itself is like a cherry on the sundae. Like the actual value to me was the experiences I had visiting stuff. I've made friends in every single book, interviewing people and learning about people. I've made friends as a result of it. So all those experiences are way more valuable than the book at the end of the day. With nonfiction, with fiction, you don't get that. You sit in your room and you write and you write. So, so it's not so the book is the satisfying product of that. But it is harder. I find fiction infinitely harder than writing nonfiction. I still write spooky books for my fiction. I'm still a horror novelist. I've written one for adults and one that's out for children, but I have one coming out this year, one coming out next year. So I write a lot of horror novels for children. Is really my vein somehow. But I get to work. The beauty of that is I get to work some of the oddities I've seen into those stories, because some of those oddities are unbelievable. Like again, a windowed grave is kind of You call me a liar and you'd probably be fine. I mean, it's like really unbelievable. So I can use that stuff in fiction as kind of surprising moments. And then when people research it and realize it's a real thing, it's kind of like a nice little aha moment.
Yes, with books like that where there is a element of reality in it, it does add an extra frisson to the reader. Could this really be true?
Yeah, exactly. Like my first adult horror novel was a haunted house story called 12 Nights at Rotter House. And I based that on an actual haunted house in Massachusetts, just like maybe half an hour from me, called the S.K. Pierce Mansion. And, so again, the book is a story. You can read it, enjoy it, but then you can really get lost down that rabbit hole if you want to look into the S.K. Pierce Mansion and everything that's happened there and the history there. It's definitely the nonfiction has informed my fiction, but again, fiction's way harder for nonfiction because the process is just not as enjoyable as nonfiction.
Yeah. What things have happened at that house you just mentioned? The S.K. Pierce, did you say?
S.K. Pierce. Yeah, so part of the reason why I wrote the haunted house novel is because pretty much all haunted house stories are the same. It's the kind of, you hear knocks, you see shadowy figures, and I wanted to kind of poke at that a little bit, but in S.K. Pierce house is no different. So it was made by a rich guy. They're always made by rich guys, right? Because it's a mansion. He was a furniture magnate because the town of Gardner, where the S.K. Pierce mansion they're known for their furniture exports. You go downtown today and there's a gigantic, 20-foot tall chair that kind of proclaims home of furniture, Gardner, Massachusetts, something like that.
Home of very large chairs, yes.
Exactly. So Pierce was a furniture magnate, and he ended up dying, and then his children fought over it. The house became a brothel for a time there. It has a very some very bad bones in the house, and then now people see again shadow people, sounds. People are supposed to have died in the house from its, its very shady past. And those are supposed to be around, stains in the wall. So nothing too surprising, but again, it's easy for me to say that here 30 miles away from it and not inside of it on any given midnight. So that was kind of what the book was about. It was trying to figure out what those tropes meant that are in every single haunted house novel.
And obviously one question is, what have you been doing over the last 12 months when lockdown has been in one form or another has been limiting things. Has that?
Yeah,
that presumably has cramped your traveling around.
it has. What we ended up doing is obviously I do a lot of writing, but what we ended up doing is doing a lot of nature stuff. So we visited probably more ghost towns. Like, I'm glad you brought that up. We visited more ghost towns over the past pandemic year than I probably did my whole entire career. Because again, they're in the middle of nowhere. Nobody's around them. They're safe. They're socially distanced. We visited a lot of graveyards because again, very few people there, and the ones that are there are 6 feet below, so that's a perfect social distance.
Yeah, they're already dead, so they're not going to be a risk to them. Yeah.
Exactly. So that's kind of the beauty of oddity hunting is I'm usually somewhere obscure. I mean, there's definitely mainstream oddities inside of museums and stuff that I couldn't go to any museums. Usually we do massive road trips for vacations or go somewhere afar. Couldn't do that. We end up just like getting a house by itself, on the ocean somewhere and just staying inside, But in general, the oddity hunting was I just stayed a lot closer. And what I learned was, which I always tell people this, but it doesn't always sink in with me, is wherever you live, like within a tank of gas, there's a bazillion weird things to go see. And I thought I'd killed my area, like my state and my area. I thought I'd seen pretty much everything, or at least knew about everything. But over the past year, I learned about all new stuff, all new monuments, different ghost towns I never heard of, new graveyards. So it's just a matter of I focused local is what I did, and then stuck to the oddity that nobody would be around. Is how I survived pandemic without going crazy.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. And sort of looking to the future, presumably you've got a growing hit list of places that you wanted to go to see, and you are now free to go and see and pursue. Any particular ones that you've set your heart on?
Definitely. So my current project, which we just sold a couple of weeks ago, is a nonfiction book about cryptids, which are all the famous monsters that may or may not exist.
Yeah.
So I want to go visit a bunch of cryptid sites. So I really, really, really want to go see. I've never been to Loch Ness. I've never been to Scotland's Loch Ness. I've been to Scotland before, but I've never been to Loch Ness. And I'm like, I need to go see. I can't do a book about cryptids and not, at some point go see Loch Ness. I want to go. There's a bunch of Bigfoot towns out west in my country that I want to go see. I hit on aliens a little bit in the book, so I want to go see Roswell in New Mexico. I was just this weekend. I went out to see the world's biggest Bigfoot statue in South Dakota, which is right in the middle of the country, plains and all that kinds of stuff. So I think all of my traveling for the next 6 months will be completely monster based, which is super exciting for me.
Yeah, yeah. And is that going to be the topic of your next book? Or, I mean, all writers, before they've even finished their current book, they're already working out in their head their next book and their book after that. I presume you've got various writing projects.
Totally. So, yes, especially splitting my attention between fiction and nonfiction. So my next book that comes out in August, and it's a children's horror novel called The Smashed Man of Dread End. And then the cryptid book that I'm working on now will be out next year, presumably, along with another fiction book. And then I have a backlog of like nonfiction projects that I would love to do if I can ever get like publisher interest in them, or get my plate clear enough that I can actually focus on putting together pitches or talking about them. So it's pleasantly busy for me right now as far as that goes. But there's always a backlog of stories and places I want to go and write about.
Yeah. What's your sort of working week like then? Is it, assuming we're talking normal times as opposed to lockdown times, do you spend time going out and about looking up items for Otis and your various projects, or do you keep that to certain times of the year and you spend most of the time sitting in front of a word processor, or how do you?
It's pretty constant. So I have I call it the Otis Map of Oddities, where every time I hear about an oddity, I put a pin in it's a virtual map, obviously it's a piece of software, but I put a pin in the map. And I have thousands just in the U.S. So I'm constantly keeping a record of that, so that anywhere I find myself. So my work rhythm is usually I'm writing 10 to 1 at night. So I'm a kind of night writer, and because I have a family and other obligations I have to do during the day, that's my writing time and research time. And then my weekends is when I really just do the traveling. So that I don't do as much writing on the weekends. It's just dedicated to going and seeing stuff. So that's generally my cadence, is writing it late at night and then going to see stuff on the weekends.
Well, I read these things about, I get up and, I start at 7 o'clock in the morning and I write through till 10, then I do something. And I mean, I'm barely conscious. I can get up at 7, but I'm can hardly string a sentence together till about 10. Never mind write something.
I assume those people have very low obligation levels in their lives, so they can just kind of leisurely write and walk around and have some tea and, wrap up their day by noon.
Yes. Yes. And then, then go play tennis or something. What?
Right.
You're living on an alternative dimension. Yeah.
Exactly. Yeah.
Yeah. No, that's intriguing. Well, it's been brilliant talking to you. Thank you, JW, for your time and sharing some of your adventures. That's been a fascinating session.
No, it was a lot of fun. I appreciate the invitation. It was a good time.
Enjoy the rest of your day.
You as well. I'll talk to you soon, Charles.
And a big thank you to JW Ocker for a thoroughly entertaining and enjoyable interview. We'll have links to JW's website and books, as well as where you can buy Don't Panic towels. You can find them on the Urban Fantasies website, in the podcast metadata, and on our Weird Tales Show YouTube site. Here's a story for the geeks among you who like science fiction novels. And it provides me with a rare opportunity to include the words sci-fi and philately in the same sentence. Philately, I should add, is the posh name for stamp collecting, not a form of oral sex. The Royal Mail, that's the UK's postal service, has just released a set of stamps commemorating classic British science fiction novels. There are 6 stamps in the set: Frankenstein by Mary Shelley, The Time Machine by H.G. Wells, Brave New World by Aldous Huxley, The Day of the Triffids by John Wyndham, Childhood's End by Arthur C. Clarke, and Shikasta by Doris Lessing. Personally, I think The Day of the Triffids is the most spectacular of the stamps in terms of design, and if you're wondering why they've just been released, it's because mid-April coincides with the 75th anniversary of the death of H.G. Wells and the 70th anniversary of the publication of The Day of the Triffids. Go to shop.royalmail.com/special stamp issues to find out more about buying the stamps. There's various formats you can get them in: postcards, display sets, and we'll also include the link to the Royal Mail site in all the usual places, on our website, in the podcast data, and on our YouTube site. And in some late travel news, there's been a lot of grumbling in the UK that the countries we're allowed to travel to avoid COVID for our summer holidays. The list is a bit limited. Places like the Falkland Isles to see the penguins, but that's about it. Not very exciting. However, here's news of a woman who has been able to get away. And the lucky woman is Paula Smith, a 50-year-old grandmother from Bradford, who says she's been abducted by aliens 52 times. She says in one incident, she spent time on a UFO where she was shown a slideshow of the Earth being destroyed by flying saucers. And she claims she's also been left with bruises left on her body as a result of some of these flights. So, at least somebody's getting some foreign travel in. Ever since Orson Welles created a mass panic across America over Halloween 1938 by his radio broadcast of an adaptation of the War of the Worlds novel, Welles adapted this story as a series of fake news bulletins describing a Martian invasion of New Jersey, but unfortunately large numbers of listeners mistook it for genuine reports. Ever since then, broadcasters have been wary of accidentally confusing their audiences with fictional reports people might believe were true. Sadly, this memo never reached a certain public safety department in Texas, we'll save their blushes by not naming them, who were testing a public alert system that is used to send out emergency and lost children alerts as text messages to people's phones. The test they devised, which due to a malfunction was distributed not once, but 3 times, warned that a person called Chucky, described as being 3 feet tall and having ginger hair, was a suspect in a kidnapping. Yes, that's Chucky, the demonic doll that starred in the Child's Play movie series. 8 movies to date and a TV series scheduled to air later this year. Well done, guys. You were meant to alert people, not scare them to death. And that's it. We're almost out of time again, but before we go, news of an archaeological breakthrough investigating the age of the UK's most notorious hillside chalk carving, the Cerne Abbas Giant in Dorset. Why notorious? Because it's also the rudest, leaving nothing to the imagination. Let's just say the figure is clearly male and is not wearing any trousers. Now, over the years, it's been suggested that the carving was prehistoric, or Celtic, or Roman, or even a 17th century lampoon of Oliver Cromwell. However, following an analysis of the sediment found in the carving, geoarchaeologist boffins working for the National Trust are now convinced the carving was done in Anglo-Saxon times, probably mid-10th century, as part of effectively a publicity campaign to convert locals to Christianity and stop them worshipping a pagan god called Helith. This possibly explains why church wardens' accounts historically feature payments being made for cleaning the giant. Needless to say, the well-endowed giant is also the subject of much sex-related folklore, the tip apparently being a good place to make love if you want children. There was also a belief that a barren woman could be cured by sitting on the tip, and even as recently as the 1990s, local witchcraft groups were holding ceremonies there for infertile couples, following an old belief that, and I quote, "a man and woman desiring issue must actually have sexual connection on the spot in order to give full effect to the charm." Given the rotten weather we've been having in the UK recently, any couples trying that at the moment are more likely to go with a bad cold and rheumatism. Now it just remains for me to say this is Charles Christian saying thank you so much for listening in. Please join me again next week for more weird tales in weird times. Until then, stay well, stay weird. Goodbye.
Black Shuck, the demon dog of East Anglia, is baying at the moon, which means it's time for us to go. You've been listening to the Weird Tales radio show with Charles Christian, your weekly fix of ghost stories, urban myths, witchcraft, folklore, and the paranormal. You can keep in touch with us online at www.urbanfantasist.com, by email to urbanfantasist@icloud.com, and on Twitter @urbanfantasist. Join us again next week for another edition of the Weird Tales radio show. Goodbye.